Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dr. Sayers Teaches Something. Today's topic is one I might not have chosen on my own, but it was requested by one of my students, and so I'm going to give it my best shot. It's one I might not have chosen on my own, partly because it is so broad. A more specific element of it, I might have been more inclined to approach. And also is a topic um, that in some ways is perhaps a bit sensitive for me to address because today's topic is the women's movement. And my birth certificate indicates that I am not a woman. Um, but it's a very important topic nonetheless. And so we'll take at least a basic overview of some of its key points from the colonial period up until at least the late 20th century. Now, in the colonial period, in the 1600s, the 1700s, and really well into the 1800s, women in principle had very few rights, although there were some exceptions here and there. In Virginia, for example, at least in the early and mid 1600s, people tended to go to Virginia in large numbers and then die. They died of yellow fever. They died particularly of malaria. Some died of starvation. Some were killed by Indians. There were lots of things to die of in Virginia, and people did it all the time. The death rate there was astounding. However, of the people who did not die, women did tend to die less than men. And there were not that many women to go around. Women had better sense than to go to Virginia in most cases. And so it was not that uncommon for a woman to come to Virginia with her husband or come to Virginia and get married and find that her husband would die and perhaps die with no children or any other close relatives in Virginia. And so his wife would inherit her husband's property. She might marry again and her next husband would die and she would inherit his property as well. And this might happen again, perhaps again, so that women sometimes, through marrying and then outliving their husbands, could build up quite a bit of wealth, and thus indirectly a great deal of social and even political influence. Some historians have described Virginia in the 1600s as a widowarchy. Indeed, in the South, um, while the plantation system was very much a patriarchal system, there are many cases where the woman of the plantation did much more work than the patriarch. In colonial South Carolina, Eliza Lucas Pinckney was famously far more clever than her husband or her brothers, and so she actually ran their plantations for them. Um, and into the antebellum South, it was not unusual for women to run plantations while their husbands were away at the cotton markets or elsewhere. Um, and behind the scenes, women might have quite a bit of influence, particularly in the South. In the North, among the Puritans, women were expected to be educated so they could educate their children to be good Christians and good citizens, which in the godly commonwealth of New England was seen as being pretty much the same thing. Very small towns that could not afford to have a public school of their own um, would often have a dame school, in which a well educated local woman would run a small school in her home. And among the Quakers of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, women were believed to be spiritually equal to men. They could even speak in the meeting house if the Holy Spirit moved them to do so. Um, so the equality that Quakers believed existed among everyone included equality between the sexes. Um, and so women did often have, often maybe a bit much, but did sometimes have actual influence behind the scenes um, in those Quaker dominated societies. Indeed, women would very briefly get the right to vote early in the history of the state of New Jersey um, under a few limited conditions until someone noticed that loophole and closed it in the early 1800s. During the American Revolution, there were some women who hoped that The Declaration of Independence's insistence that all men are created equal would include women as well. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John Adams, who was involved in almost everything important in those days, except that he had to miss out on writing the Constitution itself. She wrote to him saying, "John, remember the ladies, for all men would be tyrants if they could." She was partly joking, but mostly, I think, not. Um, hoping, hoping for more rights for women in this new republic, which for the most part did not happen, at least at first. Although the old Puritan ideal of the mother as educating good Christian children continued into the independent United States, and the idea of Republican motherhood, the idea that a mother ought to raise her children to be good citizens. Still, women were, even as adults, in an unusual position in that legally they were not really viewed as adults, but neither were they children anymore. They were in some position in between. Indeed, legally, women didn't exactly exist as discrete individuals at all, at least once they were married, under the biblical dictum that the two shall become one flesh. A woman, under the principle of coverture, was considered to be essentially part of her husband, another appendage, perhaps an extra arm or something. And so, in most cases, women could not own property. At most, a very limited amount of personal property. Um, Real estate, large amounts of money, pretty much anything, was controlled by their father when they were young. It became the property of their husband when they got married. A woman who had neither a father nor a husband would probably find her property controlled by a brother, or perhaps late in life by a son, once a woman had become widowed. Um, Although laws were passed in some places to make sure that a widow could not simply be forced out of the home in which she had lived for many years. Women could not serve on juries. It was felt they could not act independently on their own. A woman could testify in a trial, but her testimony counted for less. Of course, if a man were to testify under oath, having promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help him God, and while on the witness stand contradicted himself, then at least one of those times he would have been lying, which of course we call perjury when done on the witness stand under oath, which is pretty serious business. There's a case in Jonesboro, Tennessee, of a man perjuring himself, being put in the stocks with his ears nailed to the stocks throughout the day. In the evening, he was allowed to go home, except they first severed his ears and left them nailed to the stocks. Overnight, he could only collect them in the morning. While we don't do that anymore, perjury can still be serious business, as you could ask President Bill Clinton about, I suppose. But that's the case for a man. If a man said one thing and said something else, at least one of those times he must have perjured himself. If a woman said something under oath and later said something different, and what she had done was change her mind. It was said to be a woman's prerogative to change her mind. Women, it being felt, were such changeable creatures that they could not be expected to always think the same thing. But because of that, their testimony was given less weight, because women were thought to be inclined to hysteria. Indeed, the term hysteria actually comes from the Greek, to be overcome by your uterus. Still, and of course, women could not vote. Early on, this was partly, of course, because there were property qualifications to vote, and women couldn't own property. Even as property qualifications fell away, the right to vote was not extended to women, much to the annoyance of many of them. Women were, for the most part, excluded from higher education. There was Troy Female Seminary that opened in New York in the early 1800s. Um, Oberlin College began to admit women alongside men, um, both white and black men, in the late 1830s, I believe. But such cases were pretty rare, at least in the early and even mid 1800s. Um, but there was some pressure for change. For one thing, the religious revivals of the early 1800s, especially the 1830s, um, did lead people to see each other, in some cases at least, as being more spiritually equal, which did promote some greater social equality. Some. Women in particular were often involved in these very emotional religious experiences and found that the church was a way to gain more social responsibility and authority. As religious revival promoted other reform movements, the temperance movement, the anti slavery movement, and others, women often became heavily involved in these. Temperance, in particular, was seen as a women's issue. Um, as a drunk husband was a bad husband, potentially abusive, wasting the family's income on alcohol if he could hold down a job and make an income at all. Um, and so there was a growing push for some rights for women, a growing women's movement, as it was typically called in the 1800s and into the 1900s. Although the term feminist would be used in the early 1900s, it would not become widespread until the 1960s as a term. And the women's movement is sometimes considered to have begun in 1848, when a large number of reformers, mostly women, but a number of men as well, met in Seneca Falls, New York, um, what's usually simply called the Seneca Falls Convention. They produced the Seneca Falls Declaration, or the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which borrowed heavily from the Declaration of Independence, saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And just as Thomas Jefferson had written in the original Declaration, that the people of America owed no allegiance to a British crown that was characterized by so many acts and things that would characterize a tyrant. American women, according to the Seneca Falls Declaration, had no reason to owe their loyalty to an American government that did not treat them as equal citizens. And things did begin to change. A few states began allowing women to own some property under some conditions. This became particularly noticeable in the early 1840s in response to the Panic of 1837, as a number of states passed laws allowing women to control some property that, or at least own property. Sometimes it still had to be controlled by their husband, but at least to own property in their own name, property that could not be taken from them based on their husband's debts, in a way to keep some property in the family during the many bankruptcies that followed the Panic of 1837. Furthermore, many women, especially many Quakers, had been inspired by the anti-slavery movement in Britain and became involved both in the women's movement and the anti-slavery movement in America. And most women who wanted to push for civil rights in, say, the 1830s, 40s, 50s, did focus on the anti-slavery movement, feeling that being a slave was even worse than being a woman. Although some women asked if there was really that much difference. And after the Civil War, many women's rights reformers were disappointed that the 14th and 15th Amendments, guaranteeing civil rights and suffrage to all men, did not necessarily guarantee those things equally to women. Many rather felt cheated. The most prominent members of the women's movement in the later 1800s would be Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Of the two, Susan B. Anthony tends to be the more famous today. although both were pretty active at the time. Um, I suspect part of the reason Susan B. Anthony um, came to be the one who was more commonly promoted in historical memory was that while she certainly had some pretty controversial actions, she was in some ways the less radical of the two. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, although raised quite religious, came to reject quite a bit of traditional religious practice, and belief. In her wedding ceremony, she promised to love and honor her husband, but did not swear to obey him. All they had, I believe, 7 children, so I guess they got along all right. She eventually wrote a women's Bible, taking out all the parts of the Bible she felt were too patriarchal, and questioning a lot of traditional Christian theology. Um, so while she and Susan B. Anthony worked side by side, forming the National Women's Suffrage Association, pushing for suffrage and women's rights in general, Susan B. Anthony is the one who ended up getting a statue in Congress, if I'm not mistaken. It would be Susan B. Anthony, who would be the first woman to appear on a U.S. coin, a real woman, I should say. American coins had traditionally had Lady Liberty on them, but not till 1979 did Susan B. Anthony end up on a dollar coin. Although not a popular dollar, many people had trouble distinguishing the Susie dollar from the quarter. For one thing, a lot of people are stupid. But also, the Susie dollar is pretty similar in size and weight and color to the quarter. And honestly, with her hair tied back in the bun, Susan B. Anthony there does kind of resemble George Washington. Um, Susan B. Anthony certainly did some interesting things. In 1872, for example, she voted in Rochester, New York, along with 14 other women. All 14 of them were arrested. Susan B. Anthony herself was put on trial and fined $100, which in those days was rather a lot of money. I would say the equivalent of 10,000 today. 10,000, or about $1,000 today. Not 10,000. I'm going to stay by that. So rather a lot of money, which she refused to pay. The judge said he would not force her to pay it or imprison her for not paying it, because that made it impossible for her to appeal her conviction to the Supreme Court. The other women were arrested but not fined or tried. Instead, the voting officials who had permitted them to vote were fined and then imprisoned for not paying their fines until they were pardoned by President Ulysses S. Grant. And while New York had not allowed Susan B. Anthony or her friends to vote, women did begin getting the right to vote in the later 1800s. In 1869, the territory of Wyoming allowed women to vote in all elections. A few other western states allowed women to vote in all elections over the next few years. Utah was one of those, in part because it was felt amongst the Mormons that if every woman could vote, that could give many Mormon households lots and lots of votes on their own. But by the beginning of the 20th century, only 4 western states allowed women to vote in all elections, although a number of other states who allowed women to vote in some elections, although typically just local elections. Quite often elections just for school board, that being seen as kind of a woman's issue. And many women would take traditional ideas of a woman's place in society and use it to their advantage. During the progressive movement of the late early 1900s, many women were involved in numerous progressive causes. The women's suffrage movement was seen as part of the progressive movement. I've already mentioned many were involved in the temperance movement, which was both a rural and an urban issue by the late 1800s. Certainly the most exciting member of the temperance movement was Carrie Nation, who founded a chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Medicine Lodge, Nebraska in the 1890s, and began going into saloons and singing hymns to embarrass all the barflies. She would greet bartenders by saying, "Good morning, destroyer of men's souls." But eventually she went further. She took a sack of rocks into a tavern and began throwing the rocks through the windows and the liquor bottles. Um, then she bought an axe. And Carrie Nation is a big gal. She's over 6 feet tall. She's built like a linebacker in a black dress. And when she would go through bars with her axe, she could really tear the places up. She eventually got assistants who'd come along and sing hymns to accompany her axe chopping. She was arrested many times. She was banished from Kansas City, Missouri, but kept it up until eventually going into semi-retirement, which she funded through speaking tours and selling signed souvenir hatchets. Other women were involved in the settlement house movement, helping immigrants from other countries or even from rural areas into big cities assimilate into urban American society, teaching them English or better English, depending where they came from, helping them to dress like modern urban Americans, to accustom themselves to American food, to find jobs, and otherwise settle into or assimilate into American life, or at least what middle class Protestant Americans felt American life ought to be. And many women were involved in the settlement house movement, Jane Addams in Chicago being the most famous, as she dedicated her life to the settlement house movement and many types of progressive reforms. Many other women, though, particularly an increasingly educated group of middle class women, as about a third of college students by 1900 were women, found working in settlement houses or other reform movements one of the few things that was seen as socially acceptable for a middle or upper class woman to do outside the home. Actually, working for a living is for poor people, but charity work was something appropriate for a woman. And this was a way for a number of women to do something outside the home for a few years before settling down in their traditional role as a wife or a mother. And the temperance movement, the settlement house movement, gave many women experience in political activism, which they could then turn to the suffrage movement or to push for other political changes. Many women supported child labor laws, for example. And so were able to present that as being their natural role as a mother, looking out for children in the workplace, or better yet, out of the workplace. And so many progressives supported women's suffrage. Um, some have a genuine belief that women's suffrage was the right thing, and others because they believed women would vote in progressive ways. There was also a lot of support among white Southerners for women to vote in hopes that white Southern women would dilute the black or outnumber the black vote, which was already pretty effectively suppressed. Um, but anything that would reduce its influence even further was all to the good. So a wide range of people supported women's suffrage. Um, and and eventually, um, and eventually Congress proposed an amendment to the Constitution which would prohibit um, banning anyone from voting based on sex. That it required 36 states, 3/4 of our states at the time, to ratify that to make it part of the Constitution. And Tennessee became the 36th state to do so in late 1920, August of that year, I believe. Um, so that women's suffrage became the law of the land. The women's movement had been successful in gaining the right to vote. They'd also gotten temperance. The 18th Amendment had created nationwide prohibition in 1819. Indeed, women had supported the National Child Labor Committee, which had gotten child labor banned in the 19 teens. All the Supreme Court overturned that ban just 2 years after it was originally created. So women's suffrage had been opposed in many cases by big businessmen who liked having child labor. by the liquor industry, who worried that women would support temperance. Indeed, by many traditionalists, both male and female, who feared that suffrage would would be bad for women's traditional roles. Many progressives hoped that women, as the more moral sex, the angels of the household, would bring morality to politics, would clean up the public sphere. But there were those who worried instead that rather than women cleaning up politics, politics would simply corrupt women. Again, women did get a number of laws passed successfully, or at least were part of successful reform movements. In addition to some of these big laws, there were a number of specific protections created in the workplace for women, and usually following the logic that women need to be physically protected so that they could bear children, for the good and expansion of society. Although there were those who worried that basing those laws on the weakness or special character of women's bodies or women's role would backfire in the long run. That all laws should be based, some said, on equality, on the pure principle of equality. And this particularly coming from the heavy Quaker tradition that was part of the women's movement. Really, though, after the success of the suffrage movement, the women's movement lost quite a bit of steam for some time, as a lot of big things seem to have been accomplished. Women had gained the right to vote, so political activism much declined, although Alice Paul, one of the most radical suffragists, did write an Equal Rights Amendment in the 1920s and proposed that become part of the U.S. Constitution, and got a fair amount of support, but also a fair amount of opposition, both from traditionalists and also from some women in the women's movement, even the very liberal Eleanor Roosevelt, who feared that strict equality would strip away some of the special protections that women had won. Still, things were changing. And during World War I, many women had gone into the workplace, including middle-class women of the sort who had not worked before. And while most returned to their homes after the war, not all did. The war was such a shock to Americans that many, particularly those described as a lost generation, turned away from many traditional views about religion, about society, about other things. And many women experimented with new roles. Despite prohibition, some drank. Many smoked in public. Some drove cars. Some wore short skirts that nearly revealed their knees. Many bobbed their hair short. Whereas for a long time, the tradition had been that a woman never cut her hair. But these new women, or as they're often remembered today, these flappers, did all this and more. Even spoke very openly about sexuality, inspired in part by the popularity of Sigmund Freud and his pretty salacious notions about psychoanalysis and what it supposedly revealed about men and women's inner character, or lack thereof. Which is not to say that all women were flapping. My great-grandmother lived through this time, and I don't think she ever went out flapping. I'm certain, I don't believe she ever cut her hair in her life. When I saw her, of course, in her 80s and 90s, her hair was in huge braids wrapped all around her head. And photographs I've seen of her from the 1920s do nothing to suggest that things were otherwise then. During World War II, many women went into the workforce again, and the U.S. government actively promoted this with a lot of propaganda about how it was patriotic, but still also in some ways feminine for women to be in the factories, even doing very heavy labor. There are still ways that's shown to feminize that. And it shows an act of patriotism, but also, in many cases, in a feminine way, showing women in the factory supporting husbands fighting overseas. The U.S. government opened about 3,000 child care centers during World War II for the children of working women. All have shut them all down after the war. Um, and while after the war many women did return home, not as many as had before. And other things were changing too. By the 1950s, women had the right to serve on juries in most parts of the United States. Indeed, that had become fairly widespread by the 1930s. Women had gained the right, a real right, to own or control their property, at least most of their property under most circumstances, in most parts of the country, by the late 1800s. While there were exceptions here and there, many credit card companies would not issue a credit card to women in their own name until the 1970s, on the grounds that the real income in a household must be the man's income, and it wouldn't be fair to let a woman charge something to an account that would really be paid by her husband. So, and women would not gain credit card equality till the 1970s. But again, things did change. And then particularly starting the early 1960s, we would see the development of a feminist movement, as that term would begin to be applied on a wide scale to what had been known as the women's movement. An important leader in this and a founder of the National Organization of Women was the journalist Betty Friedan, who in the early 1960s published a book called The Feminine Mystique, based on her interviews with many women across the country, many of whom showed that they were unhappy with that mystique, a kind of mythologized, idealized view of the woman as the ideal nurturing wife and mother. Even many who said that they would have chosen that role if they could have chosen it resented they never had a choice. And more women were working and wanted to be treated better in the workplace. And this started to happen. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act was geared primarily towards equal pay for women. The idea being you should get equal pay for equal work, something that had largely been denied in the past. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, although primarily aimed at getting equal rights for African Americans, did include Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which guaranteed equality between the sexes. Title IX, to an amendment to educational laws in the early 1970s, required equality in education. Furthermore, the 1960s saw many major social changes. Of course, we see the hippies, the counterculture, questioning many things that had simply been expected in society, including traditional roles for men and women. Certainly, the free love movement challenged traditional sexual roles and values. America was experiencing a sexual revolution in the 1960s, partly due to the hippies' embrace, if you'll forgive the pun, of free love, but also due to a new medical breakthrough of the birth control pill, which first became available in the United States, I believe, in 1959. And initially was not available everywhere. In a few states, it was completely banned until the Supreme Court declared in the case of Griswold versus Connecticut, in Griswold versus Connecticut, that no state could ban the use of the birth control pill by married couples. The Supreme Court discovering in the shadows of the Constitution a right to privacy, implied by the Fourth Amendment in particular, but other things as well. Later, that decision was expanded to drop all bans on the birth control pill and most forms of birth control, which Again, for hippies experimenting with free love, I removed one of the most obvious side effects of free love, which is babies that are not free. But even for women living a fairly traditional life, this was still revolutionary for a woman to be able to choose when to have children, how many children to have, if she would have children, which also made it easier for a woman to have a longer career if she wished. And more women were choosing to have a career, and more were going to college, more wanted to work, particularly as it became socially acceptable to work. And also, as the economy hit a pretty bad patch in the 1970s, the one from which we have arguably never recovered. Um, the household incomes not having really risen significantly if you adjust for inflation, purchasing power, and so forth. Since the 1970s, increasingly women found it necessary to work, whether they wanted to or not. And many wanted to, but many did out of economic necessity. Something in the past had not been the case for the middle class. Indeed, that had often been kind of the defining feature, one of it, of the middle class, that the woman did not have to work outside the home. All that also had the flip side because a woman didn't have to, she wasn't allowed to, or at least it wasn't socially acceptable. But by the 1960s and 70s, it was becoming increasingly acceptable, in many cases, even necessary. By 1980, for the first time, more mothers of school age children were working than were not working. More recently, during the Great Recession of 2008, there was a time, at least, when more women in America were working than men, as male dominated fields were hit even harder by the Great Recession than fields in which women were more predominant. Of course, the, uh, the feminist movement of the 1960s would also see the Equal Rights Amendment, which had been written again in the 1920s, finally passed by Congress and sent out to the states for ratification. Although with a deadline, it had to be ratified by a certain date, a deadline which was later extended. And this is not unique to the Equal Rights Amendment. Some other amendments had a similar deadline built in, because if not, an amendment could just sit around forever, which usually doesn't matter. There's some silly old amendments just sitting around here and there. But you never know when one of those might get pulled out, as was the case with the 27th Amendment. It was written by James Madison in 1789, along with the 10 amendments that became the Bill of Rights, but it didn't get as much support. But every once in a while, some state would ratify it, and there was a big push to get it done, which culminated in the early 1990s. And so now, thanks to the 27th Amendment, written by James Madison, um, the the United States Congress, if it votes itself a pay raise, does not get to enjoy that pay raise until after the next election. So if you're mad your congressman gave him a pay raise, you can vote him out of office. Anyway, the Equal Rights Amendment was passed by Congress, sent out to the states to ratify, and many states, including Tennessee, ratified it, but not quite enough by the deadline. Furthermore, a powerful Stop ERA campaign formed, with one of the most outspoken spokeswomen being Phyllis Schlafly, um, who said that it would undermine, would destroy women's traditional roles, that it would completely wreck society and allow all kinds of changes in relations between men and women, even what it meant to be a man or a woman. There were those who worried that women would lose some of the legal protections they had gained in a complaint that had been heard in the 1930s. Um, in particular, there are issues with Social Security, and that a woman may collect her husband's Social Security, but a man may not collect his wife's Social Security. And of course, at a time when the draft was still going on, and many Americans were increasingly unhappy about sending their sons off to fight in Southeast Asia. They were even less happy about the idea of having their daughters drafted and sent to Vietnam, which some people said the Equal Rights Amendment would result in. And so again, while many states ratified it, it was not quite enough. Furthermore, of the states that ratified it, 5, including Tennessee, rescinded their ratifications, taking them back. Now, the Constitution doesn't say you can take back the ratification of an amendment, but also doesn't say that you can't. So I'm not sure how Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton would have felt about that one, or about many things going on in the 1960s and 70s. But in any case, the Equal Rights Amendment was not ratified even by the time the extended deadline had passed. Although quite recently, 3 more states have voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, so that if we count all the ratifications that have come in since the deadline passed, and we ignore those states who rescinded their ratifications, 38 states have now ratified it. And so arguably it could become part of the U.S. Constitution, although so far the U.S. government has said that, that it will not accept those ratifications. So for now, it is not the 28th Amendment, but we shall see. As of course, the women's movement, women's rights, and the definition and meaning of today what a woman's role is, what a woman is, and relations between men and women and otherwise, of course, have changed from the beginning of history. And are changing to this day more, it seems, in the past decade than in most decades. So we shall see where this goes from here. But those are at least some of the key points in the women's rights movement over the course of American history. And if I've left anything out, I apologize. But and hopefully this touches on the key points. Thank you very much.